Hey,
Delay.
hello everybody. So welcome to our panel discussion entitled Making the Case for Data Sharing. We have some great guests with us today. First of all, my colleague Ramona Walls. Ramona is Associate Director for Data Collaboration Center. She holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, and she is a data standards and ontology expert. Uh, with us, we also have Andrew Mulberg. So, hello, Andrew. Andrew is a pediatrist in gastroenterology with an extensive experience in rare disease, including Alagille syndrome. And Andrew is currently senior VP in regulatory affairs at Neurogen, a company working in the rare disease space and developing a pipeline for lysosomal storage disorders, including Batten disease. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Art Caplan from New York. Art is the head and founder of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Art career is just outstanding. So to cut short, I would simply say that he has been recognized multiple times as one of the most influential people in the US in fields such as American healthcare, biotechnology, and ethics. So very happy to have you with us, Art, today to bring the ethics in the data sharing discussion. Ramona, if you want to start firing the questions
Sure
for us.
thing. So the theme of this panel is making the case for data sharing. And our first question, of course, was like, why would you share data? I think that the previous discussions that have happened during this session already have made a pretty compelling argument for why you need to share data. If you're a researcher, of course, sharing data, integrating your data with other sources is really the only way that we're ever going to be able to answer big and important questions in a general sense. But within rare diseases, that becomes even more crucial. Even answering small questions in the rare disease space is something that can't be achieved without good data sharing across research groups. And of course, patients and patient organizations. I'm really happy to say that from what we've heard already today, we don't have to make an argument about why you as patients or patient representatives need to be sharing data, because thankfully you're already very willing and understand the urgency and the need to share your data. So we're grateful for that. One thing that I do want to add that I think is really important for patients in terms of data sharing is that by sharing your data as a patient or as a patient group, or even as a researcher, you become part of this larger ecosystem that's already been mentioned several times. And that's really the key to making the data more standardized and more interoperable is through these sharing efforts. So I'm not going to go on too much more about that question, though I will give my colleagues an opportunity if they want to make any more compelling arguments about why data should be shared. And if not, then okay, Art, go ahead.
Can't resist the opportunity to drone a little bit on the ethics side of that
Mhm.
question. But I'll say this, if you cut it this way. First, if a subject comes and participates in a study of Batten's disease, or they're studying boosters for COVID, or whatever the question might be, I think there is an implicit contract and promise between the investigator and the subject or the subject's family, if it's a child, to try and make maximum use of data efficiently. That's why they take the risk to be in a study or undergo the burden to travel or do whatever the study might require. They're doing it because we say we're going to get information and disseminate it. And I might add negative findings, things that don't work out. That's part of the picture too, to try and advance the field. But people are coming, sometimes with the hope that they will benefit, sometimes with the hope that their child might benefit if they're in a study. We know that that's possible, but often unlikely, particularly if they're early entrants into studies. Um, but we do tell them that we're going to get out there and use the findings and use the data. So that to me means, even though we haven't spelled it out maybe in the informed consent the way we should, but I think it's implicit, we're going to collect data in a way that maximizes its utility, that argues for the standardization, knowing what colleagues, peers, and others are doing, not letting economic interests, patenting, property control get in the way of standardization. We've got to solve that. That is a hindrance. That's self-interest of the institution and the researcher, not trying to say it's not important or that we don't manage it, but we've got to get maximum use of the data if you're going to ask somebody to be particularly in a risky or burdensome study. That is, if we can't help them or improve them, then the next thing we can do is promise to learn. And I also think it means that we promise to disseminate, promise to publish, present, share in a reasonable manner, not sitting on data for years, but getting it out there and use, because that's what you owe, I would argue again, to the subjects. So my ethical comment is research ethics demands that you think about your subject, that if we're going to start to talk about them as we sometimes do these days as partners, then my partner, if they're lucky, might get a little benefit from being in my study. But really what's going to happen is they're going to benefit, others will benefit, if we can learn. Learning means more homogeneity, more standardization, more sharing, not letting other factors, publication, money, get in the way of that harmonization, trying to solve it and talk about it with tech transfer and talk about it with journal editors so we know that we've got more standardization, and then say we've got to commit to the rapid dissemination, the real use of data. We can't be sitting on it for various reasons that might occur, which you all know and I don't have to go into. So again, I could rant on about this longer, but I'll stop. I think there's something there that you owe as an obligation in terms of data sharing.
I think that's a pretty compelling argument. Thanks, Art. Andrew, would you like to add to that argument from the industry perspective and your other unique perspectives that you bring?
Sure. It's always hard following Dr. Caplan or my wife and giving a talk afterwards. But I will summarize very briefly by saying I ascribe to the principles of Bentham and utilitarianism that were, I think, intimated by Dr. Caplan. There is a greater good applicable here that I would say in large part is being successfully implemented, but really not completely or satisfactorily. There's too many diseases that incur what Dr. Caplan refers to as the partnership with parents and patients, and in my world of greatest need of children desperately needing and expediting therapies to treat their disease. There is no data sharing. There often is the exact opposite. And I'm afraid that PAOs, patient advocacy organizations, are just really not properly informed about the right of their patients' their child's data to be utilized. So I would just simply ask for that if ethics demands action, that we take action and that we have all the stakeholders agree that we're going to take action on all the diseases that are being studied by multiple groups. And for those of you who know of me, I always talk about pre-competitive space interactions, and I think it's high time to do it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So you mentioned that not everybody shares data, and I think that's pretty well known. So maybe let's have a little discussion around some of the blocks and what it is that, before we go into the solutions, what are some of the challenges and things that are keeping people and organizations from sharing data? Alex, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I can start. I think there's always a different reason not to share data. I've been working 8 months discussing with everybody in the rare disease ecosystem, industries and registries and foundations, and there's always a concern. So how do we answer these concerns? We can address most of them, I believe. And so I think for me, I after all that time spent, I don't really see a reason not to share data, especially to our program, because we accommodate most of the concerns. I think the main issues that make it maybe more tricky than others is the question of consent. And I just saw we had a good question in the chat in the chat box about consent. But if you had obtained the consent ahead of the data collection to share the data and the proper consent, I don't see any reason not to share to us. So, for example, a lot of people in academia have concerns about publications. We have a built-in citation system at RDCA-DAP, so that when a user requests the data, he needs to sign a use agreement that is going to requiring to properly cite each contributor of the data set. So you're going to get the citations. You might be afraid of getting your results cooked. That's a concern that I've seen a lot. And I think that's really a concern. You can still share the data to us, restrict the access for a given period of time until the publication is accepted in a journal. In the meantime, we can start working on the data and we can start working on solutions. But more than that, I think you can be notified by your platform if a user wants to access your data, and that's opening up potential for collaboration. So more than a concern for me, it shouldn't be a concern, because I think what we're doing can really help you get more results and push your work ahead. I think, ultimately, and this is why I'm really having a hard time seeing why you wouldn't want to do it, is that if you want to make the data confidential, this is not what we want. We want to encourage you to share the data to us and let us share the data back to the scientific community, because that's the goal, right? We want external scientists to use the data and drive solutions themselves. And so that's the goal. But if you don't want to do that, if there's such a reluctancy that you don't want to do that because you are a biotech and you are heavily engaged in a space, and the product is not commercial yet, so you have an issue with competition, well, you have that option to put the data set confidential. And again, we can start the work and we can work internally to drive solutions. And I think I'm hoping that if that's the option you choose and you're not that reluctant to share your data, if that's the option that you choose, later on, gaining confidence in the system, traceability, security, and our ability to really push the envelope into building drug development tools that you are going to benefit from, I'm hoping you're going to leave the restrictions. So I see a lot of different blocks. I named a few of these reasons. I think we are very flexible in the way we can adapt you sharing data to us.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone else want to contribute other use cases or uses that they've run up against where people offer some reason where they really don't want to share their data that we can address and provide answers to?
I'll give you a couple of things just to toss out there. One is, when negotiating with patient advocacy groups, they don't necessarily put into their agreements or contracts some notion of there's a time limit and then this data has to come out. Now, we can argue about what that should be, and I don't actually know, and I'll leave it to better scientists who are on this panel than me to sort of say what it is. But the patient groups have some control, and they're not using it to drive the sharing of data and the standardization of data too. It's even interesting to me that some of them are becoming co-investigators. They have big investments, stand to make some returns. I'm thinking of cystic fibrosis and some of the other areas where there's been, patient group, let's say, co-involvement and sponsorship. But those agreements, those arrangements, I think, need to be examined. They need to be more thoughtfully oriented toward patient interests, not just researcher and institutional interest, which is who makes them, having written been a victim of some of this myself. I know what those guys do. So that's one. The other one I was going to mention as a hindrance is the journals. The journals have this obsession with it's got to be original. It can't appear elsewhere. Well, that's not conducive necessarily to good data sharing. Normally, people try to give a talk, slip in an abstract, try to get some of the data moving, but I think the journal editors have to change their attitudes and be more supportive of the fact that, I don't know what to call it, leaky information to try and disseminate is not incompatible with publication as an original finding. The culture is wrong, I think, in a lot of the publication end. It doesn't encourage sharing. It encourages waiting until acceptance in my journal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely would like to add to that point about publication, not only in journals, but just the notion of publication of data. And I think there's a need to shift within the scientific community away from placing the primary value on the interpretation of results, and a little bit more towards the actual value of the data themselves. Because as we know, as scientists, interpretation and results are going to change. No matter what we find as a conclusion, something is going to come along to change it in the future. And it's really that data that form the basis of all those conclusions that need to be considered the primary value and the primary output of our research. I think there is a movement within the scientific community to try to shift towards, adding value, for example, considering data publication as part of tenure. But there's still a long way to go in that regard. So, and of course, in drug development, we have other complications which have to do with industry and making money. And so my next question then for the panel is, do you think that data sharing is detrimental to pharma in terms of their making money? That's an argument that's sometimes used against data sharing.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's false, and a false impression of the role of stakeholders in industry that are really trying to do what's right for patients. I would say that to the previous discussion, one of the greatest impediments to having expedited drug development for children, especially dying from rare disease, is the fact that maybe the commercial motive is the motive for most companies to enter into the space. Let's get a drug approved. The reality is that the inertia in the regulatory process, the inability to develop concerted clinical outcome assessments that are consolidated and not regurgitated over and over again in a different way by different reviewers asking for different things. I applaud the agency's attempt to try to develop pathways for consolidation. But really the greatest impediment to making money, as you say, as the challenge statement for me, is that we have to be able to get an IND cleared in order to then do the clinical trial. The sad reality is that natural history studies, which are a critical element of the process of developing historical controls, a putative comparator for demonstration of efficacy, and then conducting appropriate trials for safety, is what impedes the so-called commercialization, which is, as you posit, the end game for all of industry. The fact is, if that was the end game, then why is that not allowing industry to do more a priori collaboration from the start? Because we're all measured by the success of our molecule, our transgene, our therapeutic agent. For me, the impediment here is not having, again, what I refer to as a top-down approach. We have to stop doing multiple natural history studies in a rare disease that maybe affects 100 children because you were the lucky company to necessarily garner all that data and not share it. These have to be pre-competitive space data repositories. And then the agency, if they had the gumption, and I would love to have an FDA colleague, former one, get on the phone with me right now and tell me what statute prohibits that from being mandated. I was involved in doing this with a group of products that was unheard of 6 years ago, and we did it successfully. Data sharing has nothing to do with commercialization and with ultimately profit. I really don't believe that that's the issue. The issue is data sharing pre-competitively to expedite treatment. And if your treatment works, as measured by the statutes, then you'll make money.
Can I jump in on that? Which I think
Please do.
comments really insightful. And I want to back up just in a small way. One value argument I dislike intensely is the movement that has been taking place, so-called right to try. Move the FDA out of the way, let patients gain access to drugs more rapidly in phase one. Sadly, some of the people who promote those ideas believe that it's up to the government or somebody to give them drug. They don't understand the role of the sponsor. But the point I wanted to reinforce is pre-approval, pre-licensure, FDA, of course, should be involved and should be trying to do what was just said, bringing people together, getting data looked at. I know I'm old enough to remember occasionally when somebody did something in gene therapy, the FDA could step in and say, we see a problem here. But then you try to figure out, well, what's the problem? And say, well, commercial reasons make us unable to share. It's nuts. Of course, we should be having FDA as a role, not just making risk-benefit judgments about, is this safe enough to take in a desperate situation? They should be the repository for homogenization standardization, insisting upon comparative data. I can't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So
Just,
that, again, some pretty, Alex, did you want to add, or was that Andrew?
yeah,
Wanted to
no, I
add
was
something?
just going to make a comment. I think, on our side, at c-path, we're a non-profit. We're not a drug development company, right? So when sharing data to us, there's no risk of us being a competition to you in terms of drug development. So, I think on that aspect, that should incentivize you as an industry to share to us. And we have a lot of people from the industry sharing to us. There is one scenario that I faced once. Luckily, it's not widespread, but I had someone from an industry to tell me that they were afraid that some of the drug development tools that we could develop, which basically are going to help clinicians do better trials, well, they didn't want their competition to have such tools. They wanted to just have the good tools for themselves and not the others. And so there's not much I can say to that. I think you should focus on your drug, getting the safest and the drug with the best efficacy possible, and hope that everybody benefits from the tool we can develop out of the data to make better clinical trials for everybody.
Thank you all. So we're getting some really great comments here in the chat. I don't know that I'm going to have time to go through all of them, unfortunately, but we'll certainly go back and try to address questions. I do want to, I want to touch a little bit on a comment here from Nicole Rivera. I think a lot of breakthroughs and innovations really come from government-funded programs and other related initiatives. Pharmaceutical companies have the money to acquire these innovative technologies and approaches so that they make money. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that.
I'd like clarification in order to respond because it's too generic.
Okay, all right. And then there was one other question that's from Jane Paulson. Who will pay for study design, standardization, data collection, and so on if we take it away from the academics and not allow it to be currency for success? So oftentimes sharing your data means losing your currency for promotion. So this is again, I think academics are actually, we've encountered there is a lot of resistance to sharing data within the academic community for precisely the reasons that Jane Paulson mentions in her comment. So I don't know if anyone is willing to take a stab at responding to that question.
I am.
Okay.
If I may just start. Yeah, I mean, as a former academic, University of Pennsylvania, I firmly believe that the tenure system is broken. But I think that everyone should start as professor, and then you go downwards if you don't publish. That's how I would reframe it. But I'm not a dean of a medical school. The bottom line is I would challenge Dr. Paulson by saying that I would be perfectly thrilled in my small role as a gene therapy developer now to work with any academic that's willing to listen to standardization. And for a rare disease, not have multiple voices try to develop a CRF for outcomes that are uninterpretable, not standardized across globally. And if there was an academic that could coordinate a specific rare disease clinical outcome assessment, CRF standardization, data dictionary, everything that's really trying to be promulgated on this wonderful day today, it would only make all of our lives that much easier. We'd all win. But ultimately, the children who are waiting for therapies to be developed, for the best agent to treat their disease, would not be hindered by all the delays from academia and from industry and the lack of sharing, which is the subject of today's discussion.
Yeah, I'll jump in with just two comments about internal publishing academic issues. One is, I'll repeat what I said before. I think the journals, editors can do a better job calming the fears of people that they're not going to be able to get published if they've ever shared data, mentioned a word, sent anything to the Critical Path Institute, that they're basically screwed to get into the journal. That can't be the attitude. It's wrong. It's just the wrong norm. It's completely discouraging, and it makes people hoard and wait and, submit to journals. And when they get published, then they start talking. But that's the wrong ethos of publication. The other comment I would make is standardization could come a little bit. We might start to use it when you have to file your study, right? If you're going to use one of the big databases to file something, they could say, that's great. You have this format. You also need this format because this is what was agreed upon as standardization to NIH databases, whatever they are. But we could insist on data deposit being in a format that others agree to. Again, the field can set the standards, or subfields can set the standards, but we now require people to put their studies on file and submit them and say, this is what we're doing, so why not standardize there?
I'm going to briefly respond to Dr. Paulson's comments in the chat. I really hope that we're not making you the enemy here. I fully appreciate the challenges that people working in having come also from an academic background. I definitely understand the challenges and the need around having to have a currency in the work that you do. And I really, really appreciate your comment about who's going to pay for the standardization, because it is a lot of work. And currently a lot of work, again, as someone who works in standards, a lot of work that often comes without reward or recognition for what you're doing. So definitely grateful to have you listening and participating today. We have, again, lots of really exciting discussion happening in the chat, but we're right at the top of the hour. So I believe that we need to end this panel. And Alex, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have the last word.
Thank you and people for that. I mean, I think I already said a bit of that. I just come discuss to us and let's assess what are your blocks. Again, like really, I think we are flexible and we have a lot of flexibility that can ensure that you can share to us and have confidence in our platform. And it's not just, like I said in my presentation, it's not just about sharing. We're not creating a new silo. We want to acquire data to do some work. And that means collaborating with you. And that means partnership, right? So that's the way we are approaching this platform. So I'm really hopeful that some of the blocks that we discussed today, are not going to be blocks in the future.
I just got a message that we have until 5 minutes after the hour. Apparently, I misunderstood the timing of this panel, so we can go back. So, Alex, sorry, it's not the last word, though. It was a great comment.
I try my best. I just had a quick question, maybe for Art, because we talked about the value of the monetary value of the data, and it's something that I've faced here and there from foundation that they need a livelihood and money. I mean, data is money. So how do we answer to this foundation that want to monetize their data because they need to get a return to make sure they continue working for their disease space?
Yeah, my comment is I understand that. I see a lot of these groups, say the Batten disease, they're small, they need to raise money. There are many other orphan diseases that are the foundations, the groups supporting them are trying to come up with some way to raise money. And it's fine. I'm not against them raising money, but set the conditions as part of the monetization about what you're going to do to standardize, the fact that you're going to try and create a registry to do comparable things with other similar disease states, let's say, or instruments or interventions. Set the terms out, in other words, that will lead to easier sharing when you're trying to monetize. They can do it. I don't think they realize the clout they have to start to change this area. By the way, I think you want to ask Alex the closing remark in 3 minutes to see if he agrees with himself.
Let me just check our questions here again. So here's a question from Christian Husu. Outside of providing funding for data entry coordination support, are there practical ways that patient groups can incentivize their academic communities to share data? Unfortunately, there needs to be more of a compelling story from institutions and data holders. So that's talking about patient groups providing incentives to academic partners.
So one way might be to get diseases that are relatives, cognate, close in mechanism and trying to seek the same set of interventions. Have them agree a little bit on registries, have them agree a little bit on data standardization, and use group power within subspaces to enforce or encourage standardization. I think that those steps could be taken if they would talk to each other in their, let's say, common spaces of common interest for certain kinds of diseases and certain types of research interventions.
Excellent. Thank you. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's fine being proactive, but I think that there's too many scenarios now where diseases, natural history registries are just not being shared, which really, as I said, come back to my earlier point, just allow for the slowness in the process of trying to develop better therapies.
Thank you. Alex, do you agree with yourself from 5 minutes ago?
I do say I agree with myself. I'm not sure what would I add. I think what I didn't say is that sometimes some stakeholders tend to overvalue their data and be overprotective, but I'm not doing much with it. So this is what we want to do. We want to do something with the data that you have, and so it's too bad that some data are just sitting in registries and not really being leveraged and the value not being maximized, because that's what you and your team are doing, Ramona, is helping maximize the value of the data. So yeah, I agree with myself.
Okay, excellent, great. And with that, now we are actually at time, and thank you, and we're handing it over to whoever's next on the agenda. Thank you so much, panel.